Hey guys, tonight we wander into a world that feels both strangely familiar and utterly alien. A time when choosing to walk away from a bad marriage was seen as worse than taking a life. Imagine that. You could stab a neighbor in a tavern brawl, serve some time in a dark cell, maybe pay a fine, and still find your way back into society. But if you dared to tell your spouse you were finished, to pack up your meager belongings and step out of the marriage bond, well, you'd be branded with a shame that clung to you like soot from a chimney fire. Divorce wasn't just frowned upon, it was an earthquake that rattled families, churches, and entire communities. And you, dear listener, probably wouldn't survive the scandal of it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love it if you drop a comment sharing your location and the local time where you're tuning in from. It's always fun to see this sleepy little community scattered across the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle through the narrow lanes of a medieval town, the smell of damp straw and wood smoke filling your nose. People glance at you suspiciously, the way they would glance at someone rumored to be unbound from marriage. Back then, marriage wasn't just two people making vows in a candlelit chapel. It was the glue that held the social order together. And if you tore at that glue, people thought you might tear everything else down with it. Why did murder sometimes get a pass when divorce did not? It's not that societies encouraged violence, though tavern fights, duels, and even feuds were so common that they became part of the rhythm of life. But a killing could be explained away, a crime of passion, a drunken mistake, or an offense to honor. Murder might shock people, but it didn't call into question the entire structure of society. Divorce, on the other hand, cracked the foundation. You see, a spouse walking away was more than a personal drama. It threatened property rights, inheritance, the stability of children, and perhaps most terrifying to those in power, the authority of the church or crown. Historians still argue whether communities genuinely feared social collapse or simply enjoyed maintaining control, but the effect was the same. A divorced person was not just seen as unlucky, they were dangerous. Picture this: a blacksmith in a small village kills a rival in a fight over ale. Horrible? Sure. But give it a few years, some penance, and a donation to the church, and the villagers may let him hammer horseshoes again. But if that same blacksmith leaves his wife because he can't stand her constant nagging about burned bread, or because she refuses to bear children, he's doomed. People whisper, customers stop coming. He may find himself exiled, forced to start again in a distant town. And the wife he left? Even worse, she's branded as damaged goods, often unable to remarry, left to scrape by in poverty. The quirky tidbit here is that in some regions, killing your spouse was considered less dishonorable than divorcing them. Dark, yes, but it reflects how permanence was valued over justice. You could be a widower, tragic but respectable, but a divorce, say, unthinkable. And let's not forget the theatre of shame. A divorced woman might be forced to wear certain clothes or sit at the edge of the church instead of in her old pew. A man might lose his guild membership, stripped of his livelihood, not because of his violence, but because of his choice to leave a marriage. Imagine how twisted that must feel as you walk those cobbled streets, realizing the murderer among you is treated with more forgiveness than the divorcee. Historians still debate whether communities genuinely believed divorce would unravel their moral fabric, or whether the ruling classes, the priests, lords, and monarchs, simply needed another tool to control behavior. Whatever the reason, the shame was real, thicker than the morning fog, and almost impossible to shake off. And here's a small joke to keep your eyelids heavy. Divorce was so scandalous that even medieval jesters avoided making jokes about it. You know it's bad when the guy who spends his days juggling geese and making fart noises with bagpipes says, better not touch that subject. As you lean back now, let that image settle. A world where walking away from a partner was considered more shocking than spilling blood in the market square. Your mind drifts, hearing the faint echo of church bells reminding everyone that marriage was forever, whether they liked it or not. You wander further into this world where marriage is less a personal choice and more a civic duty, almost like jury service with vows. You can picture the scene. A wedding procession winding down the muddy lane, the bride in a simple gown, the groom tugging nervously at his tunic, neighbours craning their necks to watch. This isn't just about two people pledging affection. It's the community's business, because in earlier centuries, marriage was understood as a public contract. It bound families together, secured property, and reassured neighbours that things were in their rightful order. You probably think of weddings today as celebrations of love, heartfelt vows, maybe a DJ who plays too much ABBA. But back then, love wasn't the headline act. The headline was the alliance. A medieval villager or an early modern merchant saw marriage as a guarantee crops would be shared, debts honoured, inheritances protected. The phrase, "till death do us part," wasn't poetic fluff. It was a legally binding promise that your kin group, your land, and even your cows were now linked to someone else's life story. And here's where it gets heavy. If you decided to undo that contract, you weren't just walking away from your spouse, you were unraveling a whole web of obligations that stretched across parents, cousins, neighbours, and the parish priest who probably officiated. No wonder divorce carried more shame than a crime of passion. Murder could be pinned on one hot-headed moment. Divorce, though, screamed of selfishness, rebellion, and a disregard for the common good, the quirky tidbit. In many medieval towns, witnesses weren't optional. People from the community had to be present at the vows, precisely so they could testify later if anyone tried to wriggle out of them. Imagine if your co-workers were legally required to sit in the front row at your wedding just in case they had to testify at your divorce trial 20 years later. That's not romance, it's crowdsourced accountability. Now, as you drift along these cobblestone streets in your mind, you hear the voices of the marketplace. Did you hear about Johann and Greta? A fishmonger whispers. They're trying to separate. Gasps follow. What will happen to a father's mill? Who gets the goats? These weren't idle questions. Property was the backbone of survival. If Johann left Greta, the stability of half a dozen families hung in the balance. Historians still argue whether communities truly feared financial ruin or simply enjoyed moral policing, but either way, the stigma was fierce. And here's your second small joke to soften the edges. In some rural villages, priests actually kept checklists of which couples were most likely to split up. Picture Father Thomas at his desk, quill in hand, muttering, "The millers argue about bread crusts too much. Better put them on the watch list." There's also the theatrical side of it. When marriage was declared, it was often announced from the church steps like a town bulletin. Bells rang, not just for celebration, but as a reminder, these two are now bound, and everyone here heard it. Which meant if you later tried to claim things didn't work out, well, too bad. The whole village had been your witness. Breaking that bond was like ripping up the social contract in front of the very people who had signed it with you. You find yourself leaning against the imaginary stone wall of that church, watching villagers nod approvingly as another couple is tethered together. You feel the weight of expectation pressing down. It's not about affection or even compatibility. It's about duty. And maybe that's the strangest contrast to today. We now assume marriages are private affairs, intimate unions between two people. But in the centuries when divorce was considered unholy, marriage was anything but private. It was the scaffolding holding society upright. Tear at it and everyone thought the structure would collapse. Final soft chuckle for this section. If someone in the village did try to escape a marriage, neighbours didn't ask why, and they asked, "But what about the pigs?" Because honestly, losing livestock was considered a far greater tragedy than losing love. As you listen, you can almost hear those bells fade into the distance, echoing through the stone valleys. A reminder that marriage was less about choice, more about chain-linking families into something bigger than themselves. And stepping out of that link, more dangerous than any blade in a tavern brawl. You keep walking down those old stone lanes in your imagination, and the deeper you go, the more obvious it becomes that marriage wasn't built on passion, but on property. You step past a timber-framed house, its beams blackened with age, and hear the shuffle of papers inside. That's no love letter. It's a dowry contract being signed, weighed, and witnessed. For many centuries, marriage wasn't about who made your heart flutter. It was about who could secure your cows, your fields, and your family name. Picture yourself in a medieval hall, the air thick with smoke, the long table crowded with relatives, clerks, and maybe a notary who charges too much. The bride isn't the star of the day, her dowry chest is. Coins clink, bolts of fabric are unrolled, and the land deed gets handed over like the crown jewels. You could almost say the groom was marrying a set of property documents with a human being attached as the ceremonial bonus. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was survival logic. Farms needed heirs. Inheritances had to be secured. You couldn't afford to leave property floating around like an untethered boat. That's why divorce felt like an explosion. If you left your spouse, the family assets might be split, the inheritance lines blurred, and entire generations thrown into uncertainty. The quirky tidbit? In some places, people valued the bed frame itself as symbolic property. There are records of medieval courts debating not just who got the sheep, but who got the actual bed the couple had shared. You can almost imagine a poor scribe rolling his eyes while jotting down testimony like, "Yes, my lord, she insists the oak bed with the carved lions belongs to her side of the dowry." Now here's the kicker. Dowries weren't just given once. Sometimes, if a couple split, even unofficially, the bride's family would storm back, demanding the goods. Return the chest, the linens, and oh, by the way, the cow too. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was financially catastrophic. No wonder communities treated it as worse than violence. Murder might take one life. Divorce threatened to unravel the economy. Historians still argue whether the obsession with dowries genuinely kept families stable, or whether it just trapped people in loveless arrangements. Some say the fear of losing property forced couples to make it work. Others argue it created a society of quiet misery, where people learned to grit their teeth for decades. Either way, the institution of property-based marriage was so rigid that tearing out of it branded you reckless, selfish, and dangerous. As you drift in this thought, you might notice how often women bore the brunt of these financial knots. A woman without her dowry was like a ship without sails, adrift, unmoored. That's why divorce left her utterly exposed. A man might still find work, remarry, or swagger into a tavern pretending he had reasons. A woman without her property? She was branded as a burden. Time for a small joke to ease you down again. In some town records, scribes carefully listed every dowry item to avoid disputes later. These lists can be pages long: 1 comb, 2 spoons, a goat, 3 hens. Imagine if today's prenups required listing every IKEA lamp and half-empty shampoo bottle. The paperwork alone might keep people married forever. And here's something more sobering. In certain regions, the church itself became the vault. Clergy sometimes acted as guardians of dowries, making sure no one sneaked away without paying debts or securing heirs. That means if you tried to separate, the church could slam the financial door in your face. Not just spiritual shame, cold, hard poverty. You stand there in that imagined hall, hearing the scratch of quills, the clatter of coins, the muttered prayers. And you realize to step out of marriage wasn't just breaking a promise. It was like tossing a family fortune into the fire. People whispered about it the way they whispered about plague. And as you breathe a little deeper, settling back into your pillow, here's your last chuckle of the section. If passion ever did sneak into these property marriages, it was considered a bonus, like finding a toy at the bottom of a sack of grain. Nice surprise, but not guaranteed. So as you drift, remember, the shame of divorce wasn't only about morality. It was about money, fields, and goats. And in a world where those were the lifelines of existence, that shame felt heavier than chains. You wander deeper through the candlelit corridors of this history, and the shadows begin to thicken around the figure of the church. Because if property and contracts were the skeleton of marriage, the church was the iron grip holding it all in place. You can almost hear the echo of monks' sandals across the flagstone floors, reminding you, Marriage wasn't just a civil affair, it was a sacrament, a holy covenant that no mortal hands were supposed to undo. Imagine yourself sitting in a pew, listening to a sermon where the priest declares, "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." That line wasn't just lofty poetry, it was law. The church made marriage indissoluble, like glue that no blade could cut. Divorce wasn't merely frowned upon, it was equated with spitting in God's face. And if you thought the local villagers were judgmental, wait until you met the canon lawyers and bishops. They treated every separation request like a crime scene. The mainstream historical fact here, by the 12th century, the Catholic Church had fully codified marriage as a sacrament. That meant dissolving it was on par with denying baptism or desecrating the Eucharist, unthinkable acts that could land you in eternal trouble. The spiritual weight was enormous. To seek divorce was to brand yourself not just a social outcast, but a spiritual traitor. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some desperate couples tried to bypass this by claiming their marriage had never been consummated. In other words, they argued the union wasn't real because the bed had never been shaken properly. Medieval courts would sometimes send nosy neighbors to testify whether they'd heard enough noise through the thin wooden walls. Imagine standing in court, red-faced, while your neighbor says, "Aye, we never heard a peep from them, not even a squeak." You probably want the earth to swallow you whole at that point. You wander further into this landscape and the seriousness grows. The church didn't just preach permanence, it enforced it with rituals of shame. If you dared to separate informally, priests could summon you before the parish court, where you might be ordered to crawl through the church on your knees, or sit in the porch wearing ashes while parishioners streamed past and whispered. Better to be caught stealing bread than trying to exit your marriage. Historians still argue whether the church truly believed it was protecting souls or whether it was simply protecting its power. After all, a marriage blessed by God gave the church a tight hold on inheritance, legitimacy of heirs, and the stability of noble alliances. Untying those knots would have loosened the church's grip on society itself. So was this about theology or about control? Scholars haven't agreed. Now here's your little laugh to soften the mood. In some rural parishes, if a couple looked like they were on the verge of separating, the priest would make them share a giant loaf of bread in public. Each had to bite from opposite ends until their lips almost met. A medieval forced Lady and the Tramp moment, except with rye bread and no spaghetti sauce to soften the embarrassment. As you lean back now, you can almost hear the creak of the church door closing behind you. Inside, the candles flicker, casting halos of gold, while the priest intones the rules. Outside, villagers nod solemnly, knowing that divorce isn't even a word in their vocabulary. Murder, they've seen it before, but undoing a marriage? That was beyond comprehension. The whisper settles in your ear. Once the church's grip closed around marriage, it became not just a private promise, but a lifelong cage, and rattling those bars was enough to make you more despised than a killer. You move forward through the corridors of time, and suddenly the walls grow taller, hung with tapestries of kings and queens, because if the church locked ordinary couples into lifelong bonds, royal marriages were chained with iron and crowned with politics. You step into a glittering hall where courtiers whisper under vaulted ceilings, and you quickly realize, here, a wedding is not just about two people at all. It's a treaty in silk and lace, a fragile piece wrapped in gold embroidery. Picture yourself at the marriage of a king's daughter to a foreign prince. The bride is only 14, her gown heavy with jewels that sparkle like promises, while courtiers tally the lands and alliances her union secures. Nobody's whispering about romance, they're whispering about borders, armies, and taxes. To undo this marriage later wouldn't just be personal heartbreak, it would be a diplomatic disaster, the unraveling of treaties that held kingdoms together. The mainstream fact? In medieval and early modern Europe, dynastic marriages were among the most important tools of diplomacy. Kings sent daughters across seas to cement peace or secure allies. Queens were married off to ensure military support. A divorce in this context was like declaring war. If one party walked away, the insult rippled across borders, sparking feuds and rebellions. And the quirky tidbit: sometimes royal contracts included backup brides. If the first daughter died en route or was deemed too sickly, her younger sister was automatically promised instead. Imagine being the spare sibling, waiting by the docks with your suitcase, just in case your older sister coughed too much on the ship. Talk about awkward family dinners. Now think of the shame if a royal divorce occurred. It wasn't just the couple in disgrace. Entire nations were embarrassed. Courtiers scrambled, poets snickered, pamphlets spread like wildfire. One king's separation could plunge half of Europe into gossip and scandal. Henry VIII's divorce from Catherine of Aragon is the headline we all know, but there were quieter examples too. Lesser monarchs who dared to push for separation and found their crowns wobbling as a result. Historians still argue whether these royal gambles were acts of courage or madness. As you wander among these monarchs in your mind, you hear the double standard echoing. A king who quietly kept mistresses might be indulged, excused as manly vigour. But a queen who hinted at divorce? Catastrophe. A woman who stepped away not only shamed her husband but insulted entire dynasties. One royal divorce could taint the bloodlines for generations. Here's a gentle joke to lighten the mood. Imagine being a royal child told your bedtime story is basically your parents' marriage contract. Sleep tight, little one, and remember you exist because we needed Saxony's cavalry. Not exactly happily ever after. And yet you lean closer, noticing something ironic. While murder could be smoothed over with bribes, treaties, or penance, divorce couldn't. A dead rival could be replaced. A severed marriage couldn't be stitched back together without tearing open wounds between kingdoms. It was shame on an international scale, one that lingered in history books and court gossip alike. So you settle into this thought, eyelids heavy, hearing the echo of royal vows recited not in chapels of love but in courts of power. Divorce wasn't merely forbidden, it was unthinkable, because it meant pulling at the very threads of crowns and kingdoms. And that kind of shame was heavier than any gallows rope. You drift now into quieter chambers, away from the jewelled courts of kings, and find yourself in the small, dim cottages where ordinary women lived. If royal marriages were political knots, ordinary ones were still shackles, but without the luxury of crowns or armies to soften the blow. For women, divorce was more than scandal. It was a lifelong branding, a scarlet mark that no veil could hide. You picture a woman stepping out of her husband's home, a small bundle of clothes in her arms, her face flushed not with anger, but with the heat of shame. The villagers don't need to ask why she's leaving. The act itself is enough. From that moment on, she's ruined. Respectable men won't marry her. Some won't even let her draw water at the same well as their wives. Even her own family may refuse her because bringing her back under their roof risks infecting their household with disgrace. The mainstream historical fact: in most pre-modern societies, women who divorced, or even attempted to, were considered socially dead. In Europe, church courts often declared them unfit for remarriage. In many Islamic societies, though divorce was legally possible, the stigma could still ruin reputations. In Confucian China, the 7 grounds for divorce meant a woman could be sent away for trivial reasons, but if she dared to leave of her own accord, she was branded unfilial, a stain on her clan. The quirky tidbit: some towns forced divorced women to wear distinctive clothing, almost like a uniform of shame. In parts of Germany, records mention women obliged to wear black veils or ragged garments that set them apart, as if the village needed a constant visual reminder. There goes the one who couldn't keep her marriage. Imagine doing your laundry with an entire outfit screaming your private business to the neighbours. You shuffle closer and the double standards sharpen. Men who strayed were sometimes winked at, even pitied for their burdens. But women who left, even if beaten, even if starved, were judged as unnatural, selfish, and morally corrupt. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed women embodied the honour of families, or whether branding them was simply a convenient way to keep them obedient. Either way, the system worked against them. Now a small chuckle to ease the heaviness. In some villages, people joked that a divorced woman could curdle milk just by walking past the churn. Absurd, yes, but it shows how superstition mixed with gossip until shame became almost magical. You picture yourself at a marketplace, watching the way eyes follow a woman known to have left her husband. She reaches for apples, but the vendor looks away, pretending not to see her. Children whisper behind her back. Her presence becomes an open wound the community can't stop poking at. For her, life narrows. If she's lucky, she might remarry a widower desperate for childcare. More often, she takes to begging or worse, is driven into prostitution, a career path society then uses to justify the very shame it inflicted. She becomes the warning story whispered to young brides. See what happens if you try to leave. And yet you lean into the irony. A woman married to a violent husband, even one who struck her in public, might be pitied. But if she dared walk away, pity evaporated. Murderers could repent, thieves could be forgiven. But a divorced woman? She remained an exile in her own town. You let your eyes grow heavier as you imagine her shadow fading down a cobbled lane, the sound of the church bell tolling not for her death, but for her social burial. And the lesson she leaves behind whispers in your ear. For women, divorce was not a chance at freedom. It was a sentence of ruin that lasted until the grave. You wander further, and the cobblestones beneath your feet echo differently now because you've stumbled into the world of men, where the rules bent just enough to expose the hypocrisy. For men, divorce carried stigma too, but it was softened by one enormous double standard. A man could chase mistresses, frequent taverns with women who weren't his wife, and even father children out of wedlock. Yet if his wife dared to leave him, she was damned while he was pitied. You step into a smoky inn, the smell of ale thick in the air. At one table sits a man boasting about his little friend in the next village, laughter spilling around him. Nobody shuns him. In fact, some clap him on the back, as if infidelity were a mark of virility. The wife at home, she'd better not say a word. If she whispered of divorce, she'd be the one disgraced, not him. The mainstream fact across Europe, Asia and beyond, legal systems were tilted toward male privilege. In medieval England, a man could sue for annulment if his wife was accused of adultery. A woman, however, rarely succeeded in divorcing for the same reason unless she had overwhelming proof, and even then she might be blamed for driving him to stray. In ancient Rome, laws allowed husbands to divorce with ease, while wives needed ironclad justifications. This inequality carried forward for centuries, shaping shame in deeply gendered ways. And here's the quirky tidbit. In 17th century France, a nobleman could openly maintain a mistress, known as a maîtresse en titre, and still be respected at court. Kings flaunted mistresses like medals, but if a queen or noblewoman even exchanged affectionate letters with another man, scandal raged like wildfire. Double standard doesn't even begin to cover it. Historians still argue whether communities truly believed men's dalliances were harmless, or whether society simply couldn't bear the thought of women having the same freedoms. Either way, the math was clear. Men's sins were excused as natural, women's choices condemned as catastrophic. You drift a little deeper into this thought, picturing the gossip mill at work. A husband who cheated might be scolded privately, maybe fined or scorned if his behavior was extreme. But the wife? She became the villain of ballads, the butt of satirical plays, the symbol of decay. Even the children's fates hinged on her reputation, and so men learned early, if trapped in a miserable marriage, it was better to sneak through shadows than seek legal escape. Society had written the script, and men knew how to play their lines. Here's your little laugh to soften it. In some towns, wives wrote anonymous complaints about their cheating husbands and nailed them to church doors. Villagers called it posting grievances. Imagine walking into Sunday Mass and reading, "To whom it may concern, Thomas smells of perfume again, and it isn't mine." Passive-aggressive medieval style. As you lean back, eyelids heavy, the irony sinks in. Murder might shock, but people could find reasons for it. Self-defense, drunken rage, a feud gone too far. A man with mistresses could be forgiven too. But divorce? Divorce said you had broken the unbreakable, tossed away the very contract of society. And that stain lingered longer than blood on the floorboards. You step back into the night air, the tavern noise fading behind you, and you sense the contradiction all around. Men indulged in private rebellion, while women bore the public shame. Yet both knew one truth, that tearing the marriage bond apart was a step so dangerous, so dishonourable, that it carried a weight heavier than the gallows. The night deepens, and you find yourself drawn toward the hushed murmurs of a courthouse or parish tribunal, where the spectacle of annulments and separations unfolds. It isn't a private matter hidden behind oak doors. It's a stage play for the community. You slip inside, take a wooden bench, and the air is thick with tension, the kind of tension that makes your shoulders hunch without you realizing it. Here, when couples tried to break apart, their grievances became public theatre. A husband might stand before the court declaring his wife barren, while she, cheeks burning, had to defend her body before priests and neighbours alike. A wife might claim her husband was cruel or impotent, and suddenly the room was buzzing, people leaning in for every humiliating detail. The mainstream fact in medieval and early modern Europe, annulment trials were often conducted in open church courts. Neighbours could be summoned to testify about whether the marriage had been consummated, whether the couple lived together properly, or whether one partner had committed adultery. It was marriage counselling, but with the whole town taking notes. The quirky tidbit: some courts actually ordered physical examinations. In cases of alleged impotence, physicians, or worse, midwives, were called to inspect and report back. Imagine the mortification. Your bedroom failures debated like a market dispute over grain prices, and the final verdict would often be read aloud in the parish square just to make sure everyone knew. Historians still argue whether these public trials were meant as deterrents, scaring others from seeking divorce, or whether they reflected a society that saw marriage as too communal to be settled in private. Either way, the result was the same. Every annulment became a scandal, etched into collective memory like a cautionary tale. You can almost hear it now, a husband's trembling voice. "She has never borne me children," answered by the wife's sharp retort. "Perhaps because you spend more time in the tavern than in our bed." The crowd stifles laughter, though some don't bother. What was supposed to be solemn judgment turns into farce, feeding gossip for months. And here's your laugh for the section. In a few towns, judges got so tired of hearing excuses that they kept stock phrases ready. One was known to mutter, "If you both hate each other this much, perhaps you're truly meant to be together." Sarcasm wasn't invented yesterday, yet beneath the chuckles the cruelty remained. To stand trial for annulment was to have your private failures carved into public record. Long after the verdict, neighbours would whisper the details. "That's the one whose husband said she was cursed," or "That's the man the midwives examined." A murderer, after penance, might return to anonymity. But a failed marriage? That humiliation followed you to the grave. You step outside again, the wooden door closing behind you, and the murmurs of laughter and judgment still echo in your ears. The whole process feels less like justice and more like a carnival of shame, where couples weren't simply separating, they were being paraded as lessons for everyone else. And as you breathe the cool night air, the thought lands heavy. In a world where divorce was more shameful than murder, the courtroom wasn't a sanctuary. It was a stage, and you were both the performer and the joke. You step out of the courthouse and wander toward the village square, where the aftershocks of those trials ripple outward. For many who dared to leave their marriages, the punishment wasn't just in the courtroom, it was in the slow exile of everyday life. Divorce wasn't a moment, it was a sentence carried out by neighbours armed with whispers. Picture yourself as one of them, the man who walks home to an empty hearth, or the woman who carries her basket to market alone. Everywhere you go, eyes follow. At the bakery, the bread seller gives you the burnt loaf no one else wants. At the tavern, the benches seem to shift away from you. Even in church, the place where forgiveness is preached, you're nudged to the cold edges of the pews. Divorce turned you into a living warning sign. Do not imitate this soul. The mainstream fact in many medieval and early modern communities, exile wasn't always physical banishment, it was social. A divorcee could still live in the same town, but doors closed, invitations stopped, trades dried up. In villages where survival depended on communal ties, this quiet exclusion could be harsher than chains. The quirky tidbit? Some communities leaned into gossip rituals, almost like amateur theatre. In parts of rural Italy, for example, neighbours staged mock funerals for marriages that ended, parading a coffin filled with household items to symbolise the death of the union. You can almost hear the snickers, "Rest in peace, holy matrimony." Imagine trying to live that down every time you saw those same neighbours at the well. Historians still argue whether this relentless gossip was a moral policing strategy or simply entertainment in places where news was scarce. Was it about protecting community values or just giving people something juicy to talk about between harvests? The debate remains, but either way, the outcome was the same. The divorcee became a scapegoat, carrying everyone's jokes and judgments. You pause at the edge of the marketplace, listening to the hum of voices. Gossip spreads faster than smoke, and it doesn't stop at your doorstep. Children repeat it in their play. Priests weave it into sermons. Even merchants in other towns might know your name, shaking their heads at the shame. A murderer could serve his time and return to work, but you? Your reputation was a bell that never stopped tolling. Time for a soft laugh before your eyes close. Some German towns actually had songs about local divorcees, catchy little rhymes sung by children as they skipped rope. Can you imagine hearing your failed marriage turned into playground lyrics? Nothing like being immortalized in the medieval top 40 of shame. And here's the cruelty wrapped in irony. Sometimes exile was literal. Divorced women in particular were driven to move miles away, seeking towns where no one knew their story. But even there, they carried a silence, a carefulness, never revealing why they left, as if shame clung invisibly, ready to be discovered. You picture yourself walking that lonely road, the dust rising around your shoes, the chatter of your old village fading behind you. There's no sword at your back, no guard escorting you out, only the weight of whispers that make it impossible to stay. And somehow that exile feels colder than any dungeon. As you settle deeper into the hush of this thought, the truth lingers. In a world that tolerated bloodshed, exile was reserved not for killers but for those who dared to walk away from vows. And that silence around you now? It feels like the same silence they carried, step after lonely step. You keep moving through the dim, stone-lined streets of the past, and soon the shadows thicken with incense and chants, because the deeper you go, the more divorce begins to look like heresy. In the medieval imagination, separating from your spouse wasn't just abandoning a person, it was abandoning God. And when the church told you marriage was eternal, trying to undo it felt like chiseling away at sacred stone. You slip into a candlelit chapel, the air heavy with frankincense. A priest stands at the pulpit, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He warns the congregation that a soul who dares to break marriage is committing treason against heaven itself. Around you, villagers nod solemnly, the message sinking in. Divorce wasn't just social rebellion, it was spiritual betrayal. The mainstream fact, by the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church treated marriage as one of the 7 sacraments, equal in gravity to baptism and the Eucharist. That meant breaking it was akin to denying the faith. In many places, attempts at divorce were classified alongside crimes like heresy or witchcraft, sins that could invite excommunication. And in an age when excommunication meant not just spiritual ruin but practical isolation, the shame was unbearable. The quirky tidbit? Some sermons compared divorced people to wandering ghosts, souls cut adrift, unable to enter heaven or rejoin the community. Parishioners were told not to share meals with them, lest their food absorbed the sin. Imagine refusing bread at a neighbour's table because her husband left her, fearing the stew might spiritually stain you. Historians still argue whether this extreme rhetoric came from genuine theology or whether it was part of the Church's campaign to secure dominance over family life. Did priests really believe God frowned harder at divorce than at bloodshed, or was the pulpit simply a tool of discipline? The question lingers like incense smoke, difficult to pin down. You wander further into this scene, watching the way punishment blurred into ritual. In some towns, divorced couples, or even those suspected of seeking separation, were forced to sit on a penitent's bench at the front of the church, dressed in sackcloth, while the priest delivered sermons on loyalty and sin. The congregation watched, and the message was clear. Divorce was not a private sorrow, it was a public heresy. And here's your soft laugh for this stretch. In one French parish, records show that a priest made separating couples hold hands throughout the entire Sunday Mass as punishment. Nothing says reconciliation like gripping the sweaty palm of the person you can't stand for 2 full hours while the choir drones on. But beneath the comedy, the weight is heavy. Divorce was seen as a rejection of divine order, more corrosive than violence, more shameful than theft. A murderer might repent, confess, and be welcomed back into the fold. But a divorcee? They were branded as rebels against heaven itself. You leave the chapel in your imagination, the candlelight fading, the night air cool on your skin. Behind you the bells toll, not for the dead, but for the living condemned. And as you step into the dark silence, the thought settles heavy. In this world, divorce didn't just threaten your earthly reputation. It threatened your eternal soul. You step back into the night air, and the question still hangs in your mind. How could it be that someone who killed in anger or plotted revenge with steel in hand might eventually be forgiven, while someone who divorced could never shake off the stain? The answer lies in how society measured shame. Violence was expected, almost woven into the rhythms of life. But divorce, that was an unraveling of the very fabric they believed held the world together. You pass through a village square where, strangely enough, a murderer has returned after serving his penance. He's thinner, haunted, but people nod to him cautiously, offering bread or work. They mutter, "At least he confessed, at least he sought forgiveness." And then, on the other side of the square, there's the divorcee, head bowed, basket empty, no one daring to meet her gaze. She hasn't taken a life, yet the shame that clings to her is heavier than iron. The mainstream fact, medieval justice systems often allowed pathways back for killers, through confession, penance, pilgrimage, or the payment of wehrgeld, compensation money to the victim's family. A murderer could, over time, re-enter society, but divorce carried no such ladder. There was no fine, no ritual journey, no act of contrition that could wash it away. Once marked, always marked. And the quirky tidbit? In some German towns, ex-murderers were even hired as executioners. Their violent past was transformed into a profession. But a divorced person? No career option existed for that. You weren't rebranded, you were erased. Historians still argue whether communities genuinely feared that divorce would unravel social order more than murder, or whether this was simply a convenient way to guard inheritance and property lines. Maybe the horror was less about morality and more about bookkeeping. After all, a dead man's land could be passed on neatly. But a divorced couple's land, now that was messy. You linger at the edge of this square and the irony sharpens. A man who spilled blood might dine again with neighbours, while a woman who sought freedom from cruelty could starve in their shadows. The scales of justice weren't balanced. They were tilted, dripping with contradictions. Now for your gentle laugh. In one English village, a returning murderer was nicknamed Honest Tom because he admitted his crime and paid his dues. Meanwhile, a woman who left her husband for beating her was nicknamed Faithless Joan. If branding irony were an Olympic sport, medieval villagers would have won gold, and so as you close your eyes a little heavier, you realize why murder and divorce were judged so differently. Violence could be explained, excused, even integrated into the churn of life. But divorce struck at the roots. It said vows could be broken, contracts unbound, God's will undone. And for societies that relied on permanence as a shield against chaos, that was the greater crime. You take one last look at the square where the murderer is cautiously welcomed and the divorcee lingers in silence, and you understand. In this world, to kill was human, but to divorce was unforgivable. You wander on, the square fading behind you, until you hear the murmur of prayers and the shuffle of bare feet on cold stone. The shame of divorce wasn't always sealed with gossip alone. It was sometimes dressed up as ritual punishment, penances so strange they seem halfway between religion and theatre. And if you had the misfortune of seeking separation, you might find yourself performing these humiliating rites for all to see. You step into a churchyard where a divorced man kneels in ashes, his head dusted grey, while parishioners file past. The priest sprinkles water on him, not for cleansing, but for scolding, and reads aloud a psalm about faithfulness. People watch, some pitying, others smirking. He isn't a criminal in chains, but he's been made into a spectacle all the same. The mainstream fact across medieval Europe, ecclesiastical courts often imposed public penance for those who attempted separation or annulment. These punishments were not corporal, but symbolic, wearing sackcloth, fasting, or making pilgrimages barefoot. The goal wasn't just discipline, but public humiliation, stamping the shame into memory. The quirky tidbit? One German account tells of a woman ordered to walk 3 times around the village fountain carrying a heavy stone, symbolizing the burden of her broken vows. Children jeered, adults muttered prayers, and by the end, the poor woman collapsed, stone still clutched to her chest. A punishment and performance rolled into one. Historians still argue whether these rituals were truly about repentance, or whether they were closer to community theatre, moral pageants staged to keep everyone else in line. Were these penances meant to save souls, or simply to scare others into staying married? The debate lingers, but the effect was clear. Shame was made visible, impossible to hide. You picture another punishment, a man and woman forced to sit back to back on a cold bench outside the church doors through an entire mass, while townsfolk filed in and out. No words allowed, just silence, 2 bodies stiff with resentment, while the priest preached about unity inside. That silence must have felt louder than the bells. And here's your chuckle for this section. In some French parishes, separating couples were dunked in the river as symbolic cleansing. It was meant to wash away sin, but most people treated it like a medieval dunk tank. Villagers cheered as the shivering pair sputtered back to shore, looking less cleansed and more like drowned cats. You let your thoughts drift, imagining the feel of ashes on your skin, the cold bite of stone under your knees, the mocking laughter of children circling around. Divorce wasn't just a private pain, it was ritualized, turned into theatre so that everyone else could clap at the morality play. And as you step away into the quiet night, the thought trails you like smoke. Better to spill blood in anger and seek confession later than to endure the long, drawn-out humiliation of being punished for walking away. For in this world, sin could be forgiven, but divorce was a performance of shame that no one ever forgot. The path leads you now through narrow alleyways where doors creak open just enough for you to overhear whispers. And here comes the strangest irony of all. While divorce was branded as the ultimate shame, secret affairs, quiet adulteries carried out in the shadows, were often tolerated, hushed up, or even winked at. It wasn't that people approved of adultery, but they found it easier to stomach a discreet betrayal than the public explosion of a marriage torn apart. You lean against the timbered wall of an old tavern, watching as a married merchant slips upstairs with a woman who is definitely not his wife. Down below, the patrons mutter, but no one dares shout it aloud. After all, so long as he keeps his household together, pays his dues, and ensures his children inherit properly, society looks the other way. But imagine if he dared to divorce. Suddenly he'd be cast into shame deeper than the tavern cellar. the mainstream fact across Europe and beyond, adultery was often handled privately, with the emphasis on preserving appearances. Husbands might tolerate wives' affairs if they were discreet, and wives were expected to endure their husbands' philandering so long as it didn't disrupt the household. The scandal was not in the act, but in the publicity. Divorce, however, couldn't be hidden. It was a rupture everyone could see. The quirky tidbit? In Renaissance Italy, some husbands actually hired servants whose unofficial job was to keep mistresses hidden from neighbours. These discretion men fetched food, arranged meetings, and even paid off gossips. Imagine explaining that line of work at the dinner table. "Ah yes, I'm professionally employed in keeping secrets." Historians still argue whether communities were more offended by the betrayal itself or by the public shame of acknowledging it. Did they tolerate affairs because they believed passion was inevitable, or because maintaining the illusion of stability was more important than truth? Scholars debate, but the silence of the records suggests people preferred not to know. You drift further, and you see the double standards sharp as ever. A man's mistress might even be accepted into circles of power if she was clever, like the famous royal favourites who influenced courts. But a divorced woman? No charm, no cleverness, no beauty could erase that stain. Murderers confessed and were absolved. Lovers sinned quietly and were forgiven. Divorcees carried shame like a permanent brand. Now for your soft laugh. One English ballad mocked a husband for his endless string of mistresses, joking that his marriage vows must have been written in chalk. But when a woman tried to leave her husband, no ballad poked fun. It was tragedy, scandal, and disgrace. Apparently, chalk vows were funny only in one direction. You pause at a doorway, hearing giggles from behind the shutters, knowing the affair inside will likely be ignored tomorrow. But if the wife inside dared to say she wanted freedom, her name would echo in gossip for decades. That was the cruel calculus. Adultery could be absorbed in silence, but divorce made too much noise. As you move on, the quiet streets seem heavier with secrets, as if every house hides an unspoken arrangement. And the thought curls around you like smoke. Society could forgive betrayal behind closed doors, but never forgiveness sought in the open. You wander now into the echoing corridors of palaces, where torchlight flickers over gold-leaf ceilings and whispers scuttle like mice along the walls. If villagers lived under the crushing shame of divorce, nobles and monarchs bore it on a scale so vast it could topple thrones. Royal marriages weren't private unions at all, they were political treaties, and when they fractured, kingdoms trembled. You picture yourself at the court of Henry VIII, perhaps the most infamous divorcee in history. The king, frustrated by his lack of a male heir, sought to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon. What should have been a domestic quarrel became an international incident. The Pope resisted, Spain fumed, and Europe buzzed like a hive of scandal. For Henry, divorce was not just about romance or heirs, it was about reshaping religion itself. And when he defied the church to secure his annulment, the shockwaves split Christendom in two. Murderers may have been punished, but they didn't launch entire reformations. The mainstream fact, Henry VIII's pursuit of divorce sparked the English Reformation, leading to the creation of the Church of England. His personal scandal turned into a seismic political shift, showing just how dangerous a royal separation could be. The quirky tidbit. Henry's court staged bizarre rituals to prove his marriages invalid. At one point, Catherine was summoned to argue in front of a tribunal while Henry sat dramatically brooding. Witnesses included servants who testified about how often the royal couple shared a bed. Imagine your marriage dissected in front of Europe, with everyone speculating about your bedtime routine. Not exactly private therapy. And Henry was hardly the only case. Across Europe, royal divorces and annulments sometimes occurred but almost always shook kingdoms. A German prince's annulment could trigger wars over succession. A French noble's divorce could spark pamphlets, satires, and years of political instability. Historians still argue whether these noble separations represented genuine attempts at freedom or cold political maneuvering disguised as piety. You drift into another court, this time a lesser-known one, perhaps in a small German duchy. The Duke seeks to annul his marriage on grounds of witchcraft, claiming his wife bewitched his body. Servants are dragged in to testify about strange herbs she kept, and suddenly the scandal becomes not just marital, but supernatural. Divorce among royals was never only about two people. It was an earthquake that rattled through alliances, inheritance, and even faith. Now for a gentle laugh. One 17th-century pamphlet mocked a noble divorce by drawing cartoons of the couple literally sawing their marriage bed in half. The satire spread faster than gossip at a tavern, proving that while murder could be solemn, divorce was ripe for comedy, at least for those watching from the sidelines. As you sink further into the quiet of your own thoughts, you notice the double edge of noble privilege. While ordinary people could never dream of divorcing, monarchs sometimes succeeded, but the price was chaos, and so paradoxically, royal divorces were both rarer and more catastrophic. You step out of that palace, the tapestries fluttering behind you, and the truth hangs heavy. Even the most powerful were not spared the shame. If anything, their separations carved deeper scars, remembered in chronicles long after their bones turned to dust. You leave the gilded palaces behind and drift back into the quieter rhythms of village life, where the stakes weren't measured in crowns or treaties but in the fragile honor of entire communities. Here, even a single divorce could ripple outward like a stone dropped in a still pond. It wasn't just two people untangling their lives, it was the whole village feeling its foundation wobble. You picture yourself in a small hamlet, roofs of thatch and smoke curling from chimneys. A couple announces they are separating, and suddenly it's not only their family at risk. The baker wonders who will inherit the wheat field. The shepherd fears the flock will be split. Parents fret that their children's marriages might now be questioned. The scandal doesn't stop at the doorstep, it creeps into every cottage. The mainstream fact: in many pre-modern societies, marriage was seen as a public alliance binding not just spouses but kin groups. Divorce threatened these bonds, jeopardizing property, inheritance, and the stability of local economies. One broken marriage was treated as a breach in the communal fence, a hole predators could slip through. And the quirky tidbit: in some alpine villages, if a couple separated, the community would actually gather and hold a mock trial, where villagers testified about how the divorce might hurt their own livelihoods. Imagine your neighbors complaining in public court that your broken marriage meant fewer hands to help with the harvest. Historians still argue whether this communal outrage stemmed from genuine fear of instability or whether it was simply a way to enforce conformity. Did villagers truly believe their survival hinged on everyone staying bound? Or did they just enjoy having leverage over others' private lives? The debate hums on, but the reality for the divorcee was the same: collective judgment. You can almost hear the murmurs in the tavern. If Greta left her husband, who's to say my daughter won't do the same? Fear spread faster than ale, and suddenly a single household sorrow became a crisis of honor for the entire parish. Here's your soft laugh. One chronicler tells of a village where, after a messy divorce, neighbors refused to attend festivals until the couple reconciled. Imagine sulking through Lent because you can't dance at Carnival until Johann and Marta decide whether they're back together. Talk about holding the whole town hostage. But beneath the humor is the weight of reality. Divorce was more than a rupture between spouses. It was interpreted as a crack in the communal wall. If one couple walked away, others might get ideas. And if too many left, the scaffolding of order, property, and piety might collapse. That was the fear whispered in pews, shouted in markets, etched into sermons. You linger at the edge of that village green, watching the suspicious glances, the tightened lips, the subtle exclusions, and you realize the cruel truth. In a society bound by fragile threads, one divorce was never just one divorce. It was a threat to everyone's carefully balanced survival. You drift along the road and find yourself before a tall stone building, colder and sterner than the cottages and courts you've passed. It's the hall of law, where the rules around marriage weren't simply moral codes or whispered judgments, but ironclad barriers written into legal texts. If gossip and ritual humiliation didn't keep couples together, the labyrinth of legal obstacles surely did. You step inside and the air is heavy with parchment and ink. Clerks scurry about, their quills scratching, their ledgers stacked high. If you came here to seek a separation, you'd better have coin, patience, and the endurance of a saint. Because the legal system wasn't built to release you, it was designed to trap you. The mainstream fact in medieval Europe, the church courts controlled marriage law, and later in many regions, state laws piled on additional hurdles. To obtain an annulment, one needed proof of fraud, impotence, consanguinity, or some other narrow ground. Divorce as we know it simply didn't exist, even in societies where civil divorce was technically possible, such as certain Islamic states or, much later, Protestant regions. The procedures were so complex and costly that only the wealthy could attempt them. And here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, you literally had to prove that you and your spouse were related by blood, sometimes by digging through generations of family trees to justify an annulment. One couple in France tried to argue they were accidentally related through a fourth cousin once removed, hoping to break their vows. Imagine hiring a genealogist just so you could get out of washing your spouse's socks for life. Historians still argue whether these legal labyrinths were truly meant to uphold the sanctity of marriage, or whether they were simply bureaucratic ways to generate fees for courts and clerics. After all, every petition, every witness, every piece of parchment cost money. Was it devotion or a business model disguised as piety? You linger in that courtroom watching the desperate faces of petitioners, a woman clutching her rosary, whispering about her husband's cruelty, a man insisting his wife had bewitched him. Both shuffled from bench to bench, endlessly delayed, until most gave up and slunk home, trapped. The law didn't say no outright. It simply made yes impossible. Here's your soft laugh. One English judge was notorious for delaying divorce petitions by asking increasingly bizarre questions. He once demanded to know what colour the marital bed curtains were, claiming it was relevant. Either he was probing for detail, or he was just redecorating his chambers on other people's dime. The truth sinks in as you lean against the stone wall. Murder could be punished, atoned, and closed like a case file. Divorce, on the other hand, was kept endlessly open, suspended in bureaucratic purgatory, a constant reminder that you weren't just breaking with your spouse, you were defying a machine designed to keep you inside. As you step back into the night, the courthouse behind you seems less like a hall of justice and more like a maze with no exit, where walls shift just as you think you've found freedom. And in that endless tangle, you see why divorce carried more shame than murder, because it was not only condemned by neighbors and priests, but suffocated by the very system that claimed to keep order. The road twists again, and now the air feels heavier, tinged with the scent of herbs, smoke, and suspicion. Because when all else failed, when communities couldn't explain why someone wanted to break free, whispers turned to darker explanations. People who sought divorce were often accused of witchcraft, cursed by demons, or tainted by the supernatural. Better to believe the devil made you do it than admit a marriage could truly collapse. You pause outside a cottage, shutters rattling in the wind. Inside, a woman accused of deserting her husband is being questioned by the parish elders. She insists she left because he beat her. But the midwives shake their heads, muttering about strange herbs found in her chest. Soon, the rumour shifts. Perhaps she bewitched him into cruelty, or maybe she sought demonic aid to escape her vows. Suddenly, her divorce is no longer a private scandal, it's evidence of sorcery. The mainstream fact: during the height of witch trials in Europe, women who defied their husbands or sought freedom were disproportionately accused of witchcraft. Divorce or even separation was sometimes cited as proof that they had disrupted the natural order through unnatural means. The idea was simple. No ordinary woman would walk away from marriage. Something sinister must be at work. And here's the quirky tidbit. In one Swiss case from the 16th century, a man claimed his wife had bewitched his trousers so he could no longer perform in bed. The court took it seriously. Rather than blame biology or age, they assumed sorcery was behind it, and the poor woman was punished, not just as a failed wife, but as a witch. Imagine being hauled into court because someone blamed their limp libido on your cooking herbs. Historians still argue whether these witchcraft accusations were truly believed or whether they were convenient excuses for controlling women. Was society genuinely terrified of spells and curses, or did men simply use superstition to tighten their grip? The debate flickers on like candlelight, but the outcome was always cruel. You walk further and the stories pile up. Husbands claiming wives brewed potions to drive them away. Wives accused of summoning demons to kill their love. Communities insisting that no marriage could break apart without supernatural interference. And so divorce was stained not only with social shame but with the terror of witchcraft, a crime that could end not in exile but in flames. Now, for your gentle laugh, one medieval chronicler joked that if every unhappy husband were bewitched, then half the women in Europe must be witches. A dark jest, but one that shows even some contemporaries saw the absurdity in blaming sorcery for sour marriages. Yet the fear remained real. You imagine standing in a courtroom, villagers glaring, a priest holding a crucifix, and the accusation echoing. She must have consorted with the devil, for no woman would abandon her marriage otherwise. That judgment carried more weight than any blade. You leave the cottage in your mind, the night cold around you, and the truth follows like a shadow. In a world terrified of disorder, divorce was too disruptive to be human. It had to be explained as witchcraft, as evil, as something unearthly. And that perhaps was the greatest insult, that seeking freedom was treated as proof you'd made a pact with the devil. You tread onward, and soon you hear the muffled cries of children drifting through the centuries. Because when a marriage broke apart, the shame didn't end with the parents. It clung to the children like a shadow they could never shake. Divorce didn't just mark a husband or wife, it stamped their offspring as cursed, illegitimate, or destined to carry dishonor through life. You imagine a boy at a village school, quill scratching on parchment, when a classmate whispers, "Don't sit too close, his parents split." The insult isn't shouted, it's slipped like a knife under the ribs. Teachers may look the other way, neighbors may purse their lips, but the boy feels the weight. He didn't choose the scandal, yet it trails him like smoke. The mainstream fact. In many societies, children of divorce were denied the same rights as others. In Catholic Europe, questions of legitimacy haunted them. Could they inherit? Could they marry respectably? Even if technically legitimate, stigma followed them in gossip, in marriage negotiations, in whispered doubts about their bloodline. In colonial New England, Puritans saw children of broken homes as moral warnings, proof of sin passed down. The quirky tidbit? In one French town, children of divorced couples were nicknamed bastard born of the living, a cruel phrase that implied they were as dishonored as illegitimate children, even though their parents had been married. Imagine growing up with that label tossed at you like a rotten apple in the square. Historians still argue whether the real fear was moral corruption or practical instability. Did people truly believe divorce cursed children, or were they just worried about messy inheritances and uncertain alliances? Scholars debate, but the result was the same. Children carried scars they never asked for. You see it more clearly as you walk past a family huddled in a cottage. A daughter is turned down by a potential suitor because her parents' divorce has left her unreliable stock. A son joins a guild but is quietly pushed aside because his family broke their vows. These are not punishments decreed by courts. They are punishments dealt out by daily life, subtle and relentless. And here's your soft laugh for the section. Some children, tired of the teasing, invented wild tales to explain their parents' split. One English boy swore that his father had gone off to fight dragons. Rather than admit he'd left for another woman, it almost worked. Until someone asked why the dragons only lived 2 villages over. Yet as you let your eyelids droop, the truth settles heavy. Divorce didn't just fracture households, it cast ripples across generations. A murderer's child might still inherit his land, might still marry, might even gain sympathy for his loss, but a divorcee's child? They bore a mark of shame that outlived the gossip, a mark carved into their very prospects. You pause, hearing those children's voices fade into the night, and you realize, in a world where divorce carried more shame than murder, innocence offered no shield. The burden fell even on the smallest shoulders. You turn down a side lane where the lamps thin out and the ground softens under your feet, because this is where people went when they couldn't go through the front door of freedom. If divorce marked you for life, you learn to disappear sideways. The world you're walking through is full of trapdoors, clever, desperate, sometimes ridiculous ways to slip the bond without ever speaking the forbidden word. You don't say divorce, you fake a death, you vanish to sea, you take the veil, you take the tonsure, you sell a wife with a rope in the market, yes, really, or you agree to live from table and bed apart while technically still married. The law kept the gate, people found hedges to crawl through. You pass a cottage where a man has left a note by the hearth, gone to war, no regiment listed, no return date. In an age before passports and photo IDs, absence could masquerade as death, and death, remember, was respectable. A widow could remarry? A deserted wife? She risked scandal, so husbands who couldn't secure an annulment sometimes curated their own funerals. A long voyage, a rumour, a conveniently lost letter. And wives, too, disappeared, joining a caravan, taking service in a far-off household, letting the village believe the river had claimed them. Grim, yes, but in a world where widow ranked higher than divorcee, playing dead could be the kinder fate. Joke 1, the medieval version of witness protection, was just a beard and 20 miles. The mainstream historical fact here is that canon law across much of Europe offered only limited exits. One was separatio a mensa et thoro, a separation from table and bed. You remained married in the eyes of God, but you lived apart, no conjugal rights, property held in awkward suspension. It soothed the conscience of courts while solving almost nothing. People treated it like a truce that never ended, not freedom, not union, just a dull purgatory where the oak bed with the carved lions, remember that argument, sat unused, each spouse claiming it in their own imagination. You step from church law to street custom and nearly trip over one of the strangest workarounds of all, English wife-selling. In the 18th and even 19th centuries, working-class couples sometimes staged a mock auction, wife led by a halter in a marketplace, bids taken, ale shared, a handshake, a paper signed, so the woman could join the man she actually wanted and the husband could save face. It wasn't legal, it was theatre. But communities sometimes accepted it as good enough, a folk divorce that created fewer ripples than a courtroom scandal. The quirky tidbit, some sales advertised extras, with her child and a featherbed, as if the featherbed sweetened the deal. Please don't try this at home or anywhere. Historians still argue whether wife-selling reflected female consent or male coercion dressed up as ritual. In a few cases, the woman reportedly insisted on the sale to escape a brutal home. In others, you hear the sour notes of pressure and poverty. The archive is muffled with ale and embarrassment, and we're left reading between the stains. Was it a door women chose, or a door men shoved them through? The debate hums like that tavern after closing. You follow the lane to a convent gate where a tired porter lifts a lantern. Inside, a few faces glow in candlelight, women who have taken the veil. Sometimes faith called them here first, sometimes fear did. Families used convents as vaults to lock away daughters from ruin or scandal, and married women sometimes sought refuge here to escape fists and public shame. A cloister wasn't an annulment, but it turned marriage into a theological puzzle. If a woman became a bride of Christ, what was her husband now? There are petitions in crabbed Latin asking bishops to bless this paradox. The church, iron-fisted on doctrine, could be soft-palmed in practice. A well-placed vow, a donor's purse, and the problem faded behind stone walls. Joke 2. The medieval way to change your relationship status was literally to marry heaven. Next door is a monastery, its gardens smelling of mint and penitence. Men fled here too, husbands who shaved their crowns and traded family chaos for 7 prayers a day. Some arrived with genuine devotion, others arrived with genuine debts. A monk's cloak could hide a complicated ledger. And once tonsured, a man was wrapped in a rule that put him out of reach of ordinary obligations, though not always out of reach of gossip. Remember Honest Tom, our rebranded murderer-turned-executioner? He might be asked to escort a runaway spouse back to town. Meanwhile, the monks argued scripture and pretended not to hear. Past the stone walls, the road widens toward a river where ships creak with planes. The sea was the oldest accomplice of vanished husbands and wives. Sailors signed on under new names, soldiers marched off behind drums and never wrote back, convicts were transported to far colonies and remarried when rumours declared the old life closed. Empire and war made better undertakers than the parish clerk. If the bells tolled for you in a home you'd left, well, oceans were very good at keeping secrets. Joke 3. The Napoleonic Wars, history's largest collection of it's not you, it's artillery. But not every escape hid behind grand walls and salty horizons. Some were stubbornly municipal. City gates promised anonymity. Stadtluft macht frei. The old German proverb said, city air makes you free. It meant freedom for serfs after a year and a day, but people stretched the idea to marriages. Arrive where no one knows your dunk tank penance or your back-to-back bench punishment. Yes, we remember. Rent a room, mind your business, and soon even a scandal can wear the city's dust and vanish. Bigamy laws prowled the streets, but identities were hazy things. There are parish books with crossed-out names and marginal notes, perhaps the same man, that feel like a shrug across centuries. Some folk tried trickster routes through the legal maze. A wife might gather midwives willing to testify to cruelty. A husband might lobby a bishop for annulment on the old standbys, impotence, fraud, secret kinship, while paying the scribe by the page. A few even staged consanguinity scandals, producing a surprise cousin to argue the union was never valid. It's a genealogical soap opera, previously on our problematic family tree. Courts yawned. The maze, remember, was designed to exhaust you. Most turned back. The stubborn slipped through cracks. You pause by a roadside shrine where someone has left a ribbon for St. Jude, patron of lost causes. Was that marriage a lost cause or a cause lost by design? Historians still argue whether these sideways exits, monasteries, wife sales, feigned deaths, kept violence down by offering pressure valves, or multiplied misery by dodging honest reform. Maybe both are true. Maybe, as with those public annulment spectacles, the point wasn't justice, it was to preserve the appearance of order, while life, untidy as ever, ducked under the rope. And because the night asks for gentleness, remember this: many who vanished were not schemers, but survivors. A woman who slipped into a convent may have been the same woman paraded with ashes on her head. A man who died at sea may have been the man who watched doors close on him after the parish branded him unbound. These aren't just stunts, they're breaths taken by people who felt the walls narrowing, who understood that to be a divorcee was to live in permanent penance, while a murderer could pay, pray, and return to bread at the table. You reach the riverbank and look back, the court with its parchment traps, the church with its sacraments and scoldings, the market with its halters and handshake deals, the cloisters that echo with other kinds of vows. Every path is crooked, yet all of them point away from the word no one was allowed to speak aloud. And that is the quiet absurdity hanging in the air, how a society that could forgive blood would force so many to pretend to be ghosts just to escape a bed they no longer dared to share. You follow the river road into the lowlands, and here the air feels colder, sharper, as if every breath reminds you of how fragile survival was. For in a world where food, shelter, and reputation were all tangled together, leaving a marriage didn't just mean loneliness, it often meant economic ruin. Divorce wasn't just scandalous, it was bankrupting. You picture a woman turned out from her home, clutching only a small bundle of linens. Her dowry, absorbed long ago, stays with her husband's family. The cottage she scrubbed for decades isn't hers. Even the goats grazing in the field aren't hers. She steps into the village square, not just shamed but destitute, forced to beg for scraps or take in endless washing to survive. The shame was heavy, but poverty heavier still. The mainstream fact in most pre-modern societies, marriage was not only a personal union, but an economic partnership. Women especially depended on their husbands for property rights, protection and livelihood. Divorce stripped them of these, often leaving them legally vulnerable. In England, before the 19th century, a married woman's property belonged to her husband. After divorce, she could be left with nothing but debts. The quirky tidbit: in some parts of 18th century France, a divorced woman was required to wear a special headscarf when she went to market, supposedly to signal her status. But many vendors used it as a cue to charge her higher prices, knowing she lacked bargaining power. Imagine being punished twice, first by shame, then by inflated cabbage prices. Historians still argue whether these economic penalties were deliberately designed to deter divorce or simply byproducts of a system built to funnel wealth through male inheritance. Either way, the result was crushing. Men might at least retain trades or guild memberships after a scandal. Women almost never did. And without wealth, without land, and without kin willing to shoulder the disgrace, survival became a daily calculation. You walk further and see another image. A man who left his wife finds himself expelled from his guild, a shoemaker without a shop, a merchant without his stall. The logic was simple. If he couldn't keep his house in order, how could he keep his work in order? His livelihood slipped away like sand through fingers. In towns where reputation was currency, divorce bankrupted you long before the coins were gone. And here's a soft laugh to lighten the edges. One German guild had an official bylaw stating that divorced men could not be trusted with leather, as if marital failure somehow made you incapable of cutting a sandal straight. The rule sounds absurd, but it was dead serious to them. You pause at a wayside inn, watching how travellers exchange coins for bread. Money moves easily between them, but not for a divorcee. To carry that label was to carry invisible debt, one you could never pay off. Even if you worked, even if you scraped, the whispers ensured you remained poor. The irony sharpens as you realize a murderer could inherit land if pardoned, continue farming, rebuild wealth. But a divorcee, even if blameless, could lose everything. It wasn't justice, it was arithmetic stacked against freedom. As you settle deeper into the hush of this thought, the truth weighs on you. Divorce wasn't just shame heavier than murder, it was ruin heavier than chains. To leave your marriage was to leave your livelihood, and few survived the fall. The road winds you toward a lively square where the smell of roasting meat drifts and the sound of fiddles carries across the cobbles. At first, it feels festive, until you notice the laughter aimed not at jugglers or musicians, but at someone caught in the middle of a cruel joke. Because in many places, divorce wasn't just punished with silence and exile. It became comedy, fodder for plays, satirical poems, and bawdy ballads that turned personal misery into public amusement. You imagine yourself slipping into the back row of a makeshift theatre, wooden planks creaking beneath benches. The actors are dressed in exaggerated costumes, mocking a husband who cannot keep his wife, or a wife who traded her vows for vanity. The crowd howls, children laugh, old men slap their knees, ale sloshes from mugs. Nobody thinks of the real couple sitting at home in shame while their neighbours roar at their expense. The mainstream fact: in early modern Europe, pamphlets and stage plays often lampooned divorced or separated couples. Satire was a way to police social norms while entertaining the masses. In Elizabethan England, playwrights used divorce scandals as punchlines, often portraying wives as shrews or men as cuckolds. Public humiliation turned into cheap theatre. The quirky tidbit: in 17th century Germany, one carnival troupe staged a mock divorce court where costumed actors dragged puppets of husbands and wives apart with ropes. while a clown pronounced nonsense verdicts. It was meant as comic relief, but audiences jeered the puppets as if real couples were on trial. Imagine being a divorced villager in that crowd, knowing everyone was laughing at you by proxy. Historians still argue whether this ridicule functioned as social control, shaming people into staying married, or whether it was simply entertainment for bored townsfolk. Perhaps both. After all, nothing tightened the grip of conformity like laughter, and no wound stings longer than being turned into a joke. You picture yourself in a tavern later, where men sing ballads about a woman unfaithful as spring rain. These songs spread faster than gossip, passed from village to village. Divorce made you infamous even among strangers who had never seen your face. A murderer's tale might be whispered in fear. A divorcee's tale was sung aloud with rhymes to make the shame stick. Here's your soft laugh. One English ballad ended with the punchline that a divorced man should wed his boots, for they fit him better than any wife. Not Shakespeare, but good enough for ale-soaked chuckles. And so, as you rest your head, you realize the cruelty of it. Laughter that lifted others' spirits crushed the spirits of the divorced. Murder might horrify, but at least it was treated with solemnity. Divorce, by contrast, was reduced to slapstick, a circus of shame disguised as entertainment. The square fades to silence around you, but the echo of mocking voices lingers, reminding you that in a world where divorce carried more shame than murder, the final cruelty was to make you the village punchline. The laughter of that carnival square fades behind you and the path darkens. Now the shame of divorce takes on a harsher shape, not merely whispers or jokes, but branding, literal and symbolic marks that clung to people for life. In some communities, a divorced man or woman was treated almost like a criminal, forced to wear certain clothing, carry certain symbols, or endure nicknames that followed them like shadows. You walk into a small town where the church bell tolls for morning mass. At the edge of the square stands a woman in a coarse grey cloak, not by choice, but by decree. She is a divorcee, and the cloak marks her as such. People know instantly what she is, as if shame needed a uniform. No one asks questions. The garment itself answers them. The mainstream fact: in parts of Europe during the Middle Ages and early modern period, communities imposed symbolic badges of shame on divorced people. These weren't official prison sentences, but communal customs, meant to keep the person visible as a moral warning. Much like adulterers in some Puritan colonies were forced to wear letters or signs, divorcees too could be made into walking symbols of failure. The quirky tidbit: in one German village, records describe divorcees being forced to carry a broom during public festivals to show that they had swept away their vows. Others were paraded with broken rings strung on a cord, the fragments jangling at their necks. Imagine the humiliation. Your broken marriage turned into noisy jewelry that everyone can hear before they even see you. Historians still argue whether these stigmas were consistent across regions or whether they were localized bursts of cruelty. Some scholars suggest these rituals were exaggerated in chronicles for effect, while others believe they were common enough to terrify people into submission. Either way, the symbolism was clear. You weren't just free of your marriage, you were marked as unfit. You linger near the church doors and hear parishioners mutter cruel nicknames. A divorced man might be called Empty Hand, suggesting he had lost his wife, his property, his dignity. A woman might be dubbed Broken Bed, as if her entire existence were reduced to a splintered piece of furniture. Children picked up these nicknames and sang them in rhymes. The stain wasn't just visible, it was audible, echoing through the years. Here's your soft laugh. One English satirist joked that divorced men should wear hats with holes in them, so the world may see their wits run out. It was a cruel joke dressed as clever wordplay, but the image of dozens of men walking around in holy hats is almost absurd enough to make you smile in spite of the sting. But behind the chuckles, the truth weighs heavy. Divorcees were given marks of shame precisely because society wanted them to carry the burden outwardly, never able to slip back into anonymity. Murderers could serve penance, perhaps return to work unnoticed. But divorcees carried their stigma like a brand, always visible, always remembered. You step away, and the cloak of the divorcee rustles behind you in memory, a sound that feels like chains, though no iron is present. And you realize the cruelty of divorce's shame lay not just in gossip or poverty, but in being made into a living symbol, a warning carved into the fabric of community life. The path takes you toward a quiet cloister of thought, where scholars still sit with their parchments, debating questions that never quite find answers. Because even centuries later, historians argue over whether the strict rules around divorce were really meant to protect society or simply to keep people trapped in misery. And here you realize the shame of divorce wasn't just lived by the couples, it's still wrestled with in the margins of books. You picture a dim study lined with shelves, candlelight flickering across heavy tomes. One historian argues that rigid marriage laws preserved order. If divorce had been easy, they claim, families might have splintered, children scattered, villages weakened. The harsh stigma, though cruel, may have been the mortar that kept fragile societies from crumbling. Others lean back in their chairs and shake their heads. No, they insist. Those same laws condemned people to decades of silent suffering, their lives devoured by duty while freedom was denied. The mainstream fact, modern scholarship remains divided. Some researchers emphasize that strict divorce laws stabilized inheritance, property rights, and kinship networks, all vital for medieval survival. Others stress the psychological and human cost, trapped spouses, domestic violence, and widespread misery hidden behind stable households. The quirky tidbit? In the 19th century, one French historian tried to argue that divorce bans kept love pure, since couples were forced to make it work. His critics mocked him by saying, "If chains keep love pure, then prisons must be paradise." Historians, it seems, were no kinder to each other than villagers were to divorcees. You imagine listening in on these debates, the rustle of quills punctuated by raised voices. Some insist the shame surrounding divorce was functional, like scaffolding that propped up fragile societies. Others argue it was a weapon, wielded to control women and protect property. Both sides gesture at the same evidence, parish records, court transcripts, folk songs, yet the interpretations twist like smoke. And here's your soft laugh. One academic conference on medieval marriage reportedly ended in near chaos when two scholars got into a shouting match about whether divorce laws reduced or increased adultery. Someone joked afterward that the debate itself was proof of why people wanted divorces in the first place. As you lean back into this candlelit study of the mind, your eyelids heavy, you realize the truth is probably both. The rules around divorce did keep some communities steady, but at a cost. People stayed together because they had to, not because they wanted to. And while stability reigned, the quiet suffering beneath it is harder to measure, harder to record. Historians still argue, and perhaps they always will. The debate drifts around you like a lullaby, voices fading in and out, each convinced of their view, none fully able to resolve the paradox. Was divorce more dangerous than murder because it threatened society's survival, or because it threatened the illusion of control? The answer lingers just out of reach, like the smoke of that candle guttering low. You leave the cloister of debate and step into a hall filled with maps and artifacts, where the world stretches beyond Europe's stone walls. Because while divorce carried unbearable shame in Christendom, other continents wrestled with it too, often in strikingly different and sometimes eerily similar ways. The shame wasn't a purely European invention. It was a thread woven through cultures from Asia to Africa to the Middle East. You pause in a Japanese village of the Edo period. Here, a husband could write a simple mikudari-han, a 3.5-line letter, to dismiss his wife. No courts, no witnesses, just brush and ink. Divorce, technically, was easy for him. But for her, the shame was immense. A woman cast out carried the stigma of rejection. Her family's honor dented, her prospects narrowed. Men wielded dismissal like pruning shears, while women bore the mark of discarded branch. The mainstream fact in Confucian societies such as China, The 7 grounds for divorce gave men clear authority to repudiate their wives, grounds ranging from barrenness to jealousy. But women rarely had the right to initiate divorce, and those who tried risked branding themselves as disobedient daughters, dishonorable wives, unfilial subjects. Honor codes, not just legal codes, enforced the shame. The quirky tidbit? In some Chinese villages, a divorced woman might be forced to sit outside the ancestral hall during festivals, excluded from family rituals. Imagine watching incense burn and drums sound, but being barred from stepping over the threshold where your ancestors were honored. That exclusion hurt more than hunger. You drift further into Ottoman Istanbul. Islamic law technically allowed divorce, with detailed rules for fairness in dowry and support. Men could initiate talaq, women, in theory, could seek khul by returning the dowry. Yet the social stigma often outweighed the legal permission. A woman who pursued khul could be whispered about as shameless, her reputation curdled in the marketplace. Historians still argue whether Islamic societies were more flexible than Christian ones, or whether community shame simply filled the gaps left by law. Across Africa, too, divorce was possible in many tribal systems, but the shame varied. Some communities allowed remarriage freely, while others branded divorced women as cursed. Anthropologists have recorded folk tales where divorce is linked with misfortune, drought, famine, or disease, as if breaking a union could ripple through nature itself. And here's your gentle laugh. One West African proverb said, "A man who divorces too often must be married to ghosts." The idea was that no living woman could tolerate him, so clearly his wives had died and come back just to haunt him away. You stand in this imagined global hall, maps unfurled, voices from different continents mingling. The lesson feels the same. While the rules changed, the stigma lingered. Whether through Confucian honor, Islamic modesty, or European sacrament, divorce marked people as dangerous, dishonorable, even unnatural. And so, as you rest your head, the truth spreads wider than the oceans. Shame didn't belong to one culture. It was a global currency traded across time and place, heavier than iron, sharper than knives. Murder could sometimes be forgiven. But divorce? Across continents, it left scars that outlived the people who bore them. You step across the ocean now, carried into the timber-framed houses and stark meeting halls of colonial America. Here the air feels thinner, stricter, weighed down by scripture, and the eyes of neighbors who saw sin in every creak of the floorboards. If divorce was scandalous in Europe, the Puritans of New England made it almost unspeakable, ranking it beside blasphemy and treason as crimes against God and community. You picture a Puritan meeting house, plain wooden benches, no tapestries, no color, except the black gowns of elders. A man and woman stand before them, trembling. Their neighbors fill the pews, staring with grim interest. The elders read aloud the charges. She is accused of forsaking her covenant, he of breaking his vow. To speak of divorce here is to speak of rebellion against the Almighty himself. The mainstream fact, in colonial New England, divorce was technically permitted in rare cases, such as adultery, abandonment, or cruelty, but it was so heavily stigmatized that pursuing it often destroyed both parties. Records from Massachusetts and Connecticut show that less than a handful of divorces were granted each year, and each became the subject of gossip for decades afterward. The quirky tidbit. In one Massachusetts case, a man petitioned for divorce on the grounds that his wife had called him a cabbage head in public. The court denied it, ruling that verbal insults were not sufficient grounds. But the insult itself outlived the trial. He was mocked as old cabbage head for the rest of his days. Divorce denied, nickname permanent. Historians still argue whether Puritan rigidity was driven more by theology or by their obsession with social order. Was it truly about protecting souls or about keeping their fragile new colonies stable against the wilderness? Some say both, pointing to the way church and state blurred in Puritan law. The shame of divorce here wasn't just personal, it was civic. It threatened the harmony of an entire struggling settlement. You step outside that meeting house and see how the stigma bleeds into everyday life. A divorced woman might be barred from communion. A divorced man might be refused credit at the general store. Even their children bore the suspicion of moral failure. In a colony where every hand was needed to build fences, harvest crops, and guard against hunger, divorce wasn't just disapproved, it was practically treason against survival. Here's your soft laugh. In one New Haven record, a judge dryly noted that a couple could not dwell in peace, and suggested they dwell apart until Christ returns. Not exactly a solution, unless you were planning to wait a few millennia. And so you drift through those stern streets, hearing the crackle of fireplaces and the murmurs of neighbors. Murder in a colony might earn you the gallows, yes, but at least it ended. Divorce earned you something worse. Endless whispers, endless exclusion, a life sentence of shame that rang louder than any church bell. The Puritans built their houses tight together, their fences close, their watchfulness constant. And in that closeness, divorce became more terrifying than death, for it tore at the bonds that held a fragile community in place. You step away from those Puritan streets and into a brighter age, the Enlightenment, when candle flames burned beside ink-stained manuscripts and new philosophies stirred in the coffee houses. For centuries, divorce had carried the stench of scandal and ruin, but here, in the 17th and 18th centuries, winds began to shift. Slowly, cautiously, the idea emerged that marriage might be more than a prison, and that breaking it might not always be worse than bloodshed. You picture yourself in a Paris salon, velvet curtains drawn, philosophers debating with cups of chocolate in hand. One man insists that marriage must remain indissoluble. It is God's bond, society's foundation. Another leans forward with a sly smile and argues that if governments can dissolve alliances and rewrite treaties, surely ordinary people should not be chained forever in misery. Gasps ripple through the room. The suggestion is radical, even dangerous. The mainstream fact, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Montesquieu, and later Mary Wollstonecraft began to question the rigidity of marriage laws. They argued that reason, personal happiness, and natural rights should matter more than blind obedience to tradition. These seeds of thought, though resisted fiercely, would eventually lay the groundwork for legal reforms in the 18th and 19th centuries. The quirky tidbit? In some coffee houses, satirists mocked arranged marriages by staging fake auctions of unhappy spouses, parodying the way communities treated people like property. It was part comedy, part critique, and though frowned upon by authorities, it hinted at a growing impatience with the old order. Historians still argue whether Enlightenment debates truly changed society at large or remained the playthings of elites. After all, peasants in the countryside were still trapped by stigma and law. But in the courts of kings and the pamphlets of radicals, a new vocabulary emerged, words like choice, consent, and liberty. Divorce remained scandalous, but whispers began to suggest it might one day be thinkable. You imagine strolling down a street in Paris, pamphlets fluttering in the wind. One cries out for freedom from oppressive unions. Another condemns divorce as the devil's tool. The debate has shifted from private shame to public politics, and though the old shame lingers, cracks are forming in the wall. Here's your soft laugh. One English wit quipped that if philosophers kept writing about liberty in marriage, soon wives would demand voting rights for the breakfast menu. The joke reveals both the fear and absurdity of change. Progress always looks laughable until it arrives. You rest now against the wooden counter of that coffee house, listening to the murmur of voices rising in boldness. Divorce still carried more shame than murder in most villages, but in the cities new words were being spoken, words that suggested the prison doors might not always stay locked. And as you drift deeper, you feel the shift, the beginning of a world where shame could one day give way to choice. You step out of that noisy Paris coffee house and into a courtroom lit by tall windows, where the Enlightenment's whispers begin to take form as actual laws. It is the late 18th century, and the air feels tense, as if centuries of chains are rattling just a little looser. After ages of being unthinkable, divorce is cautiously, haltingly allowed in some corners of the world, but only under strict limits that left shame intact. You picture yourself in revolutionary France, The monarchy has fallen, pamphlets scatter like leaves, and radicals declare that citizens should be free not only in politics but also in their private lives. In 1792, France legalized divorce for reasons ranging from cruelty to incompatibility of temper. Imagine that, a law finally admitting that misery could be grounds for freedom. For a few short years, couples lined up to end unions that had stifled them. It was noisy, messy, but liberating. The mainstream fact revolutionary France became the first modern state to broadly legalize divorce, only to restrict it again under Napoleon in 1804. The pendulum swung wildly, reflecting society's deep unease. In England, divorce required a private act of parliament, so expensive that only the wealthy could attempt it. Elsewhere, reforms trickled slowly like drops on the stone. The shame remained, the law only shifted the walls. And the quirky tidbit? In France's revolutionary years, divorce was sometimes so quick that couples celebrated with parties, neighbors feasting as if it were a second wedding, except this one ended things instead of beginning them. Satirists joked about divorce breakfasts, where estranged couples toasted each other before walking away. Briefly, divorce became fashionable, a symbol of liberty, before the backlash slammed down again. Historians still argue whether these early reforms truly freed people or merely replaced one cage with another. Some point to statistics showing women used the new laws in surprising numbers, seizing rare chances at independence. Others note that backlash was swift, fueled by fears of moral collapse. Divorce was permitted, but it carried a red-hot brand of scandal, sometimes hotter than before. You drift further into England, where a man of means petitions Parliament for divorce. The chamber fills with gossip. Newspapers print every sordid detail. The law may grant him freedom, but at the cost of turning his marriage into tabloid fodder. A poor farmer in the countryside, meanwhile, has no hope. Divorce is still a privilege of wealth, out of reach for those who suffer most. Here's your soft laugh. In 18th century London, one satirical paper printed fake divorce classifieds, advertising imaginary spouses for sale. Wife, seldom used, prone to sighing, inquire at Fleet Street. Dark humour, but it shows how even as reform inched forward, society still laughed to keep its fear in check. You lean now against the wooden rail of that French courtroom, watching a couple walk away, free at last, yet branded with whispers. The law had shifted, but shame trailed them like a second shadow. And as you step back into the street, you realize reform didn't erase stigma, it only made it visible in new ways. You follow the cobbled street and hear the rustle of paper before you see the crowd. Pamphlets fluttering, broadsheets nailed to posts, scandal sheets passed hand to hand. For if early divorce reforms cracked open the door, public gossip came rushing through like a storm. Suddenly, divorces weren't whispered in dark corners, but splashed across headlines, devoured by readers hungry for tales of betrayal. You picture yourself in London, 1820s, a newsboy shouts on the corner, shocking case of adultery and separation, crowds gather to buy the sheet, scanning every lurid detail. The court transcripts, meant to be dry records, are copied almost verbatim, except with a wink, a flourish, a gleeful emphasis on the juicy parts. Divorce was still rare, still shameful, but that very scarcity made each case into a spectacle. The mainstream fact, in 18th and 19th century England, divorces were so difficult to obtain, often requiring a private act of parliament, that each one became headline news. Newspapers reported the accusations in detail, sometimes inventing extra colour. The public devoured these scandals like serialized novels, turning the misfortune of couples into entertainment. The quirky tidbit? In France, during the brief liberal period of the 1790s, satirical cartoons showed estranged couples literally cutting their marriage bed in half, each dragging away a piece. Some pamphlets even printed mock certificates of divorce that readers could fill out as a joke. Divorce had been deadly serious, and now for a moment it was both scandal and comedy. Historians still argue whether this public attention helped normalize divorce or reinforced its stigma. On one hand, the gossip spread awareness and made separation seem less unthinkable. On the other, it cemented the idea that divorce was a public disgrace, a scandal to be consumed rather than a private decision to be respected. You stroll further and see the odd duality in action. Aristocrats' divorces are mocked in print, but secretly envied for their daring. Middle-class couples tremble, knowing their petition might become tomorrow's gossip column. The poor, excluded from the courts, watch from afar and mutter that divorce is just another luxury of the rich. Here's your soft laugh. One London newspaper got so carried away with its divorce coverage that it printed a column called Parted This Week, as if announcing the latest society couples like theatre premieres. Readers joked it was cheaper than a playbill and twice as entertaining, but beneath the jokes you feel the sting. To divorce in this age was not just to free yourself, it was to hand your reputation over to the presses, to be devoured by strangers you'd never meet. Murderers faced courts in solemn silence. Divorcees faced columns, caricatures, and cheap rhymes pinned to tavern walls. As you leave the square, pamphlets crunch under your feet, ink smudging your hands. The scandal sheets flutter in the breeze, a reminder that by the 19th century, divorce had become something new, not merely shameful, but spectacular. And in that spectacle the old cruelty lingered, because once your name was printed, your shame was permanent. You step away from the paper-strewn square into streets that feel oddly familiar, streets where gas lamps glow but shop windows glitter with modern glass, where carriages clatter alongside the first rumbling streetcars. The centuries have rolled forward, and yet the whispers about divorce still linger. The laws have changed. The word no longer carries the same impossibility. But the shame, it clings like perfume you can't wash off. You picture yourself in late Victorian London. A woman sits at tea with her neighbours. Her dress is fine, her manners polished. Yet one guest leans close and murmurs, "She's divorced, you know." The words hang in the air, heavier than any confession of theft or even a duel. Murder, at least, was usually explained. A crime of passion, a tragic mistake. Divorce was harder to excuse because it suggested choice. She chose to walk away, and that choice marked her. The mainstream fact, even after legal reforms made divorce more accessible in the 19th and early 20th centuries, stigma persisted. Divorced women were often excluded from polite society, and divorced men faced suspicion in business or politics. Well into the 20th century, many churches refused remarriage, branding divorcees as morally suspect. The quirky tidbit. In early 1900s, America, Reno, Nevada, became infamous as the divorce capital because of its lenient residency requirements. So many people traveled there to end their marriages that railroads offered divorce specials, discounted train fares to Reno. Imagine booking a vacation package titled 7 days, 6 nights, and 1 annulment included. Historians still argue whether modern societies truly shed the old shame or simply disguised it in subtler forms. Divorce rates rose, yes, but the social penalties endured. Women especially found themselves whispered about, judged as poor mothers or selfish wives. Men, though freer, often carried the label of failure. A murder trial might end in a verdict and be forgotten. A divorce lingered like a ghost in every introduction. This is Mr. So-and-so, he's divorced. You drift further into the 20th century. Newspaper society columns still reported high-profile divorces with a mixture of scandal and fascination. Hollywood stars became cautionary tales, their failed marriages splashed across screens. Even in the glitter of modernity, the old pattern remained. Adultery tolerated, violence explained, divorce unforgiven. Here's your soft laugh. One American gossip columnist in the 1930s joked that Hollywood weddings should be filmed as shorts instead of features, since they rarely lasted longer than the previews. The joke drew laughs, but beneath it lay the same old cruelty. Divorce was still theatre, still spectacle, still stigma. And as you let your eyes drift heavier, you realize how tenacious the shame has been. From medieval courts to modern tabloids, the act of divorce has always carried echoes of treachery, weakness, or rebellion. Murder may shock, but it fades into silence. Divorce speaks louder, for longer, dragging its echoes across decades. You step into the glow of those street lamps, feeling the weight of a truth that stretches from cobbled alleys to neon boulevards. Even in the modern age, where laws soften and freedoms grow, the whispers remain. Divorce may no longer be worse than murder in law, but in gossip, in memory, in judgmental eyes, it often still is. The lamps dim and the streets around you grow quieter, softer, until the world feels less like a place you walk through and more like a memory fading into the dark. You've travelled centuries, villages, courts, palaces, markets, and everywhere you've seen how divorce carried a weight heavier than almost any crime. Now at the end of this long path, the story settles into its final truth. The shame was never just about leaving a spouse, it was about threatening the illusions people lived inside. You imagine standing at the threshold of time, looking back. You see women forced to wear grey cloaks, men mocked in satirical plays, children marked as cursed, neighbours gossiping over wells. You see courts where couples sat back to back in humiliation, and palaces where kings split churches in two just to walk away. In every place, the same paradox. Murder could be forgiven, adultery could be hushed, but divorce was treated as a crack in the world itself. The mainstream fact. Only in the last century has divorce become broadly accessible without permanent stigma, and even then it lingers. In many cultures today, whispers still trail divorced women more than men. Some churches still frown on remarriage. And in politics, business, or family gatherings, the echoes of that ancient shame sometimes remain. The quirky tidbit? In the 1960s, Italy still required a formal parliamentary debate for each divorce petition. Imagine lawmakers setting aside foreign policy just to argue whether Signor Rossi and Signora Rossi could finally part ways. Divorce was still spectacle, only now played out under fluorescent lights instead of torchlight. Historians still argue whether strict marriage laws truly held society together or simply kept misery invisible. Perhaps it doesn't matter. What matters is how much human weight was carried in silence, how many lives bent themselves into shapes they never wanted, all to avoid being marked as worse than a killer. And now, as your steps slow, the story softens. The road behind you grows hazy, as if history itself is falling asleep. You're left with the faint toll of church bells, the murmur of gossip fading into nothing, the rustle of parchment closing. Divorce, once a scarlet sentence, is no longer death to reputation everywhere, but its shadows still linger in corners of the world. You lean back, eyes half closed, and feel the lesson curl around you like a blanket. That freedom once came at the price of exile, ridicule, and ruin, and that shame, though softened now, is part of a long echo of fear. Fear of disorder, fear of choice, fear of change. And now, as we end this journey, let your breathing slow. The harsh clang of courts and the sharp whispers of villagers fade away, softened by distance. Imagine the cobbled streets emptying, the candles guttering out one by one, until only the hush of night remains. The people you've passed, the shamed women in grey cloaks, the mocked men in taverns, the children branded by rumour, they all dissolve into history's mist. Their voices are quieter now, their burdens lighter, as if time itself has carried them off to rest. The bells that once tolled against them fall silent. In their place, you hear only the soft rustle of leaves, the steady lap of water against a riverbank, the gentle hush of wind across old rooftops. The world feels less judgmental here, less cruel. The echoes of laughter and condemnation grow faint, as if they belong to another life, one you've simply observed from afar. Your own breath becomes the rhythm now, in and out. Each inhale draws in calm, each exhale releases centuries of heaviness, the weight of shame, the sting of gossip, the clatter of courtroom benches, all of it drifts further away. What remains is only the softness of now, the warmth of your own space, the quiet comfort of being here, safe and still. So rest knowing that even the deepest stigmas of history eventually fade, and that every echo, no matter how loud once, is softened by time. Let your body sink, let your mind settle. You've walked a long road tonight, and it's time to set it down. The story closes like a book on your lap, its final page whispering, "Sleep well, you are unburdened."